There is a photograph that almost nobody talks about anymore. It was taken sometime in the mid-1990s, on a film set somewhere between chaos and magic, and in it, a young woman with an enormous smile. The kind of smile that seemed physically impossible, the kind that made strangers feel personally chosen, is laughing so hard her eyes have disappeared into crescents. She looks invincible. She looks like someone who has never once been afraid of anything in her life. And that is exactly what made the image so dangerous. Because behind that smile, behind what would become the most recognizable mouth in the history of Hollywood, there was a story that nobody wanted to tell. A story of loss so early it rewired her nervous system. Of loneliness so specific it had a texture and a smell. Of a woman who spent decades giving the world joy while quietly rationing her own. What does it cost to be the most beautiful woman in the world? What happens to the girl underneath the legend? And what does it mean when the person everyone thinks they know is, in many ways, still a mystery, even to herself? Stay with this, because what you're about to hear changes the way you see everything. She was born on October 28, 1967, in Smyrna, Georgia, a small suburban town just outside Atlanta that smelled of pine resin and summer heat, and the particular kind of southern dust that settles on everything like a second skin. Smyrna in the late 60s was not glamorous. It was not cinematic. It was lawns and churches and the sound of screen doors, and it was the kind of place where people knew your family before they knew your name. Julia Fiona Roberts came into that world as the third child of Betty Lou and Walter Grady Roberts, two people who were, in their own complicated way, extraordinary. Her parents ran an actor's workshop in Atlanta. They had once dreamed of stages and spotlights themselves, and they passed that hunger down to their children the way some families pass down recipes. Not through instruction, but through atmosphere, through the constant low hum of creative ambition that filled their home like music. Her older siblings, Eric and Lisa, would both eventually find their way into entertainment. The Roberts household was, on its surface, a place of artistic energy and warmth. But underneath that warmth, as it so often is, there was friction, there was tension, there was the specific pressure of a family held together by passion and torn apart by the very intensity of that passion. Julia was small for her age, quieter than people expected given the volume of her later fame, and she grew up watching her parents with the careful attention of a child who understood, without being able to articulate it, that the adults around her were carrying weights that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with her at the same time. Her mother and father divorced when Julia was 4 years old. 4. An age when the world is still primarily sensory, when love is mostly warmth and smell and the specific weight of a hand. And suddenly that world split in two. Her father, Walter, moved out. And then, not long after, he remarried. Her mother remarried too, to a man named Michael Motes. The blended family that followed was not the kind that gets depicted in heartwarming television specials. It was difficult. It was complicated. And for a girl who was already sensitive to the emotional temperature of every room she entered, it was an education in impermanence, in the idea that the people you love most can simply, one day, be somewhere else. The single most defining wound of Julia Roberts' life did not happen on a red carpet or during a film shoot or in the pages of a tabloid. It happened quietly, the way the deepest wounds always do. In 1977, when Julia was just 9 years old, her father, Walter Grady Roberts, died. He died of throat cancer. He was 43 years old. 43. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means to be 9 years old and to lose your father. Not to distance, not to divorce, not to the complicated mathematics of a broken marriage, but to death, to finality, to the specific and absolute silence of a person who was there and then simply is not. Julia had already navigated the confusion of her parents' separation. She had already learned to move between two worlds, two homes, two versions of what a family could be. And then one of those worlds went dark entirely. There are things that happen to children that do not announce themselves as trauma. They arrive quietly. They settle into the bones. They become the invisible architecture around which the entire personality is built, the thing you are always reaching toward or running from or trying, in some unconscious and achingly human way, to repair. Losing a parent at 9 is one of those things. It does not make you broken, but it makes you someone who understands, at a cellular level, that nothing is permanent, that love can end, that presence is never guaranteed. Walter Roberts had given his daughter two things before he died: a love of storytelling and a smile so wide it seemed borrowed from someone more fearless. Julia would spend the next several decades using both of those gifts to build a life he never got to see. And there is something in that, something tender and terrible, that runs underneath every performance she has ever given. The years that followed her father's death were not kind in the way that fairy tales require. Julia's mother struggled financially. The family moved. There were years of real scarcity, not the cinematic kind of poverty that gets romanticized in biopics, but the actual, grinding, unglamorous reality of not having enough. Julia has spoken in interviews about wearing the same clothes repeatedly, about the particular anxiety of not knowing if things would be okay, about the way financial instability teaches you a specific kind of vigilance that never fully leaves you even when the money eventually comes. She was a teenager in Georgia in the early 1980s, which meant she was navigating adolescence against a backdrop of hairspray and humidity and the slow, suffocating social architecture of Southern girlhood, a world where beauty was currency and conformity was survival. Julia was neither fully one thing nor another. She was not the most popular girl. She was not invisible. She was something more uncomfortable, visibly different in ways she couldn't quite name, carrying a quality of intensity and presence that made people pay attention without quite knowing why. She was also, by her own account, profoundly lonely. That loneliness had a shape. It had a sound. It sounded like the pause before she spoke in a room full of people who already knew each other. It felt like sitting on the outside of a joke. And it lived, most acutely, in the absence of her father, in every moment that should have been ordinary but wasn't, because there was always this gap where a person was supposed to be. She graduated from Campbell High School in 1985 and made a decision that surprised almost no one who had been paying attention. She left Georgia. She moved to New York City to be near her brother Eric, who had already begun building a career in acting. She was 17 years old. She had almost no money. She had a face that stopped traffic and a determination that had been tempered, over years of quiet difficulty, into something very close to steel. New York in the mid-1980s was not the sanitized, monetized version of itself that exists today. It was loud and dangerous and extraordinarily alive. It was the kind of city that either broke you or became the best version of you, often both, sometimes simultaneously. Julia worked as a waitress. She modeled. She auditioned and auditioned and auditioned. She did small television roles. She was turned down more times than she will ever fully disclose in interviews, because that is the specific humiliation of rejection. It multiplies in memory even as it fades in fact. And then, slowly, something began to shift. She landed a small role in a 1987 film called Blood Red, which went largely unnoticed. But the camera noticed her. The camera always noticed her. There is a quality that certain performers possess, a quality that resists technical description but is immediately recognizable, where the lens seems to lean toward them, seems to find them even in a crowd, seems to understand intuitively that whatever this person is doing, it is worth watching. Julia Roberts had that quality from the beginning. Her first real breakthrough came in 1988 with Mystic Pizza, a warm and modest film about three young women working in a pizza parlor in Connecticut. Julia played Daisy Araujo, passionate, complicated, fiercely alive, and even in that relatively small context, something unmistakable happened. Critics noticed. Audiences noticed. There was a collective intake of breath from the industry, the kind that happens only when something genuinely new arrives. A recognition that this person was not just talented, but different. That she was, in the specific and unquantifiable language of stardom, a star. But it was 1990 that changed everything. It was 1990 that turned Julia Roberts from a promising young actress into a phenomenon. Pretty Woman was not supposed to be what it became. It was originally conceived as a darker, edgier story, a film with harder edges and less romance. And then Julia stepped into the role of Vivian Ward, and something alchemical happened, the kind of transformation that cannot be engineered or predicted, only recognized in hindsight. She brought a warmth to the character that was entirely her own, a radiance that somehow made the implausible feel not just believable, but necessary. The film earned $363 million worldwide. Julia Roberts was 22 years old, and overnight, not metaphorically, but almost literally, she became the most famous woman in the world. The smile was everywhere, on magazine covers and billboards, in living rooms and movie theaters. That smile, her father's gift, her inheritance from the man who died before he could see her use it, became a cultural symbol so pervasive that it was almost impossible to remember it belonged to an actual human being. And that was precisely where the trouble began. Fame, at the scale Julia Roberts experienced it in the early 1990s, is not a reward. It is a weather system. It moves in, and it changes everything. The pressure, the temperature, the very atmosphere of daily life. You cannot prepare for it, because nothing that exists in ordinary human experience maps onto it. You cannot learn from other people's accounts of it, because the knowledge is entirely experiential and entirely solitary. You can only go through it. And going through it, for Julia, was not graceful. It was not the glowing ascent that the magazine profile suggested. She was engaged to actor Kiefer Sutherland in 1991, a relationship that carried all the volatile energy of two very young, very famous people orbiting each other in a world that made sustained ordinariness nearly impossible. 3 days before their scheduled wedding, 3 days, she called it off. The tabloids erupted. The coverage was merciless in the way that only early 90s celebrity journalism could be. Personal, invasive, and entirely unconcerned with the humanity of its subject. She was called difficult. She was called cold. She was called a runaway bride, a phrase that would follow her with such persistence that it eventually became the literal title of one of her films, a moment of dark industry humor that said more about Hollywood's relationship with female pain than anyone at the time seemed to notice. She left for Ireland shortly after the broken engagement. She spent weeks there, away from cameras and reporters and the grinding machinery of American celebrity, walking along coastlines that were green in a way that felt almost aggressive, breathing air that tasted like rain and distance. Ireland was, for her, a kind of exhale, a place where nobody needed her to be anything in particular. She came back changed, not transformed, not healed, but changed, quieter in a specific way, more deliberate. The films that followed were uneven. There were missteps. There were choices that confused people. She pulled back from the relentless exposure of early fame, made herself less available, less legible to an industry that preferred its stars to be perpetually visible. And there were people who interpreted that withdrawal as evidence of decline, who mistook privacy for failure, silence for defeat. They were wrong. In 1997, my best friend's wedding arrived, and with it came something that felt like a new version of herself, still luminous, still magnetic, but now with a complexity that hadn't been fully accessible before. And then in 2000, Erin Brockovich. A film that was not about glamour or romance or the particular kind of beauty that had made her famous, but about a real woman, imperfect, loud, irreverent, righteous, fighting a corporation with nothing but her own ferocious conviction. Julia didn't just play Erin Brockovich. She inhabited her. she disappeared into her. And when the Academy Award was placed in her hands in March of 2001, when she stood at that microphone and delivered that breathless, enormous, unforgettable speech, it felt less like a crowning moment and more like a reckoning. Like the industry finally catching up with something she had known about herself for years. She was 33 years old. She had survived the impossible weight of early superstardom, the public dissection of her private life, the years of uncertainty, and the particular cruelty of a world that loved her image while remaining largely indifferent to her interior. And she was standing there, holding a golden statue, wearing a vintage black and white gown, laughing and crying simultaneously, with that smile, the one that had started everything, the one that came from her father, blazing across her face. She married cinematographer Daniel Moder in July of 2002, on the 4th of July, at her ranch in Taos, New Mexico. The relationship had been complicated in its beginnings. Daniel was still technically married to his previous wife when they met, and the tabloids treated the early stages of their relationship with a particular contempt reserved for stories that could be made simple by removing all context. But what emerged over time was something that defied the narratives the press wanted to impose, a partnership that was, by every visible measure, real, grounded, mutual. They have 3 children together, twins Hazel and Finn, born in November of 2004, and Henry, born in June of 2007. Julia has spoken about motherhood with a directness and lack of sentimentality that feels entirely her own, acknowledging how much it has altered her, how completely it has reorganized her priorities, how it has given her an anchor that fame, for all its magnitude, was never able to provide. She has spoken about making her children's lives as ordinary as possible, about driving carpools and attending school events and being, as much as a woman of her specific visibility can be, simply present. At 58, Julia Roberts occupies a space that is unusual in Hollywood and, perhaps, in the culture more broadly. She has not chased relevance in the frantic, performative way that the industry so often demands of women who have passed a certain age. She has not pretended that time doesn't move. She has not reinvented herself according to the tastes of a younger audience or contorted her image to match the expectations of a social media landscape that rewards a particular kind of relentless self-exposure. She has, instead, done something quieter and in many ways braver. She has simply continued to be herself. She has spoken in recent years about her conversion to Hinduism, which she described discovering during the filming of Eat, Pray, Love in 2010, a spiritual shift that was not dramatic or sudden but gradual and deepening, like water finding its way through stone. She has spoken about the practice of finding stillness, of returning again and again to something underneath the noise, of understanding, after decades of being looked at, that the most important seeing is internal. Her children are growing. Her ranch in New Mexico, where she can walk out at dawn and watch the light change over red rock and sage, remains her center of gravity. She is, by her own account, happy in ways she did not know how to be in the hurricane years of early fame. Not perfectly happy. Not the happiness of someone who has resolved all their contradictions, but the happiness of someone who has made a certain peace with complexity. And yet, there is still, if you look carefully, if you watch the interviews closely, listen to what she says and what she chooses not to say, that flicker of something unresolved, that quality of a person who is still, quietly, working something out, still reaching towards something she may not have a word for. Still, in some corner of her interior life, a 9-year-old girl in Georgia who lost her father on a Tuesday afternoon and has been carrying that loss ever since, building an entire magnificent life around the shape of what was taken. The smile has never gone away. It cannot go away. It is structural at this point, woven into the very fabric of who she is. But if you look at it now, at 58, You can see something in it that was always there, but perhaps harder to read when everything was so new and so loud. You can see that the smile is not simple, that it contains grief and joy simultaneously, the way certain pieces of music seem to be in a major key and a minor key at exactly the same time, so that you cannot quite decide whether you are listening to something happy or something heartbreaking, and you eventually understand that the answer is both. And now, I want to speak to you directly. You, watching this right now, wherever you are, in your car or your bedroom, or the small hours of a night that has asked too much of you. I want you to think about what you've just heard. Not about Julia Roberts as a celebrity, not about the awards and the box office numbers and the tabloid headlines. Think about her as a person. Think about the 9-year-old who stood at a graveside in Georgia and had to find a way to keep going. Think about the teenager who left home with almost nothing and walked into the hardest city in the world on faith alone. Think about the young woman who stood at the center of a fame so enormous it had its own gravitational field, and who managed, imperfectly, humanly, at great cost, to remain a person inside it. We are so quick to consume the people we love from a distance. We are so quick to decide we know someone based on what they are willing to show us, which is always only a fraction of who they actually are. And we are so quick to forget that the things which make someone remarkable, the resilience, the warmth, the capacity to make a stranger feel seen, almost never come from ease. They come from the places where something broke and had to be put back together. That smile of hers, that wide, impossible, world-stopping smile that her father gave her and that she has given to every room she has ever entered, is not the smile of someone who has never suffered. It is the smile of someone who has suffered and decided, over and over again, to meet the world with open hands anyway. That is not a small thing. That is not an accident. That is a choice, made daily, in the privacy of a self that no camera has ever fully reached. What is the thing in your own life that you carry quietly? What is the grief you've built your strength around? What is the gift that came from the loss you would give anything to undo? Julia Roberts has not finished becoming who she is going to be. And neither, it is worth remembering, have you?